I'm 41, and as a single university professor, I'm often asked the question, do you feel like God has called you to be single? And I have to honestly say, I don't. I've felt God's call in my life in a number of different ways. I felt God specifically calling me to serve in different places around the world and in different contexts. I think ultimately for all of us, our number one call is to Him. The rest is vocation or location. But as we look at that question, I think many of us struggle with that. And I can't honestly say that I feel like I've been called to be single. However, where God has me right now, I'm in a season of singleness, and that may be for the rest of my life. And that's okay. But as we look at that, I've had people say and ask the question, well, but don't you feel like if God called you to be single, He'd take away the desire? You know, I don't feel like God's taken away the desire for me to be married, and so therefore God's not calling me to be single. Sometimes I think it's less about what He's called us to do in that sense, and more about where He has us in that moment, and being obedient to Him and running after Him and following Him in the midst of that. When we think about that idea that if God calls us to something, He's going to take away our desires for something else, I don't know that I see in Scripture many places where God takes away our desire in that. Whether we're talking about desires for material things, desires for relationships, sexual desires, all of those things, as we look at that, God doesn't take away those desires, but He asks us to look to Him in the midst of those. He asks us to make choices and to honor Him in the midst of those. And so as we look at that, and we look at the choice that we have in that, yes, desires are still there. Yes, there are days, especially when it snows where I live and I have to shovel it myself. I definitely wish that I was married. But then there are a lot of other days where I recognize the opportunities that I have as a single woman, the opportunities to serve, the opportunities to invest in students, the opportunities to travel and be part of what God's doing around the world for a short amount of time or for a longer amount of time that I wouldn't have if I was married. And so I think, again, it comes back to that perspective and to making the most of where He has us, and realizing that He's not going to take away those desires necessarily, but He is God. He is the one true creator, sovereign God, and He is enough to meet us in the middle of those desires and be enough in the midst of that. And really, for all of those desires, all of those are temporary. Whether it's material or sexual, any of those things, all of those are temporary. And when we look to Him, we find eternal fulfillment, and we find our identity, and we find our completion in Him and in Him alone.